The silence here was different. Not the quiet hum of a city apartment after Sarah had gone to sleep, nor the polite, strained quiet of mourners. This was a silence that swallowed sound, thick and heavy, like a shroud woven from dust and forgotten breath. It was why I'd come. I needed it to consume me, to mute the endless loop of the accident, the screech of tires, the shattered glass, the final, terrifying stillness. Sarah. Her name was a raw wound, perpetually weeping inside me. I gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight against the cracked plastic, as the old pickup truck finally crested the last rise. Below, nestled amongst a tangle of skeletal winter trees, sat the house. My grandmother's house. Dilapidated was too kind a word. It was a carcass, picked clean by time and neglect, its windows like vacant eyes, staring out from a skull of weathered timber and crumbling brick. A single, rusted gate hung askew on its hinges, groaning a welcome I didn't want to hear. The gravel driveway, barely visible beneath a carpet of dead leaves and encroaching weeds, crunched under the tires like brittle bones. I parked by the overgrown porch, the engine dying with a final, shuddering sigh that echoed in the vast emptiness. No birdsong, no wind chimes, just the rasp of my own breathing. It smelled of damp earth, decay, and something else, a faint, sweetish tang I couldn't quite place, like old, forgotten flowers. The porch steps groaned under my weight, each one a protest. The front door, a heavy slab of oak scarred by decades of weather, resisted, then gave way with a mournful shriek, revealing a more of impenetrable gloom. My breath plumed in the air. Dust motes danced in the anemic shafts of light, piercing the grimy windows, like tiny, frantic spirits. The furniture, draped in white sheets, resembled a graveyard of forgotten giants. My grandmother's scent, a mix of lavender and mothballs, still lingered faintly, a ghostly caress. But beneath it, that other smell persisted, subtly cloying. I walked through the echoing rooms, my footsteps loud and intrusive. The kitchen, once vibrant with the clatter of parts and the aroma of baking, was now a tomb of tarnished copper and cracked linoleum. The living room, where my grandmother would tell me stories by the crackling fire, held only the spectral outlines of memories. Each room was a monument to what once was, and what now was irrevocably lost. I chose the smallest bedroom upstairs, the one overlooking the overgrown garden. It felt less grand, less imposing than the others. I wrestled a thin mattress off the back of the truck, dragging it up the creaking stairs, the effort a welcome distraction from the clamor in my head. With a makeshift bed on the floor, a single lamp I'd brought, and a box of essentials, I was ready to face the night. Or rather, to let the night consume me. I told myself it was just the house, breathing its ancient breath. It was my mind, frayed and bleeding, playing tricks. Then it happened. It wasn't a word, not exactly, but a soft, sibilant sound, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, right inside the room. Nothing. I must have imagined it. Grief was a cruel architect, building phantom sensations from thin air. I closed my eyes, willing myself to believe it was exhaustion, the vast, echoing emptiness of the house amplifying my own fractured thoughts. It was like someone had just passed by, a breath of icy air stirring the quiet. This was targeted, personal. I needed a distraction, something to ground me. I decided to find an old blanket, something with my grandmother's residual warmth. The linen closet, I remembered, was in the master bedroom, the grandest and most desolate room in the house. I grabbed my lamp, its weak beam cutting a wavering path through the gloom as I ascended the stairs again. The air was thick, almost viscous. The large four-poster bed, draped in a sheet, seemed to loom in the center, a monumental presence. I pulled aside a corner of the sheet, revealing the dust-covered mattress, the faint imprint of a long-gone body. I remembered my grandmother often sitting there, her back to the wall, writing letters. I moved towards it, a strange compulsion guiding my steps. The desk was covered in a thick layer of dust, but as my light fell upon it, I noticed something peculiar. The topmost drawer was slightly ajar, almost imperceptibly so. My grandmother was meticulous. She never left anything open. My heart gave a lurch, a sudden, unwelcome jolt of adrenaline. My fingers, trembling slightly, reached for the drawer. It slid open with a soft groan, revealing not the usual assortment of stationery or trinkets I expected, but a single, unsettling object. Nestled on a faded velvet lining was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Its form was elongated, almost stretched, with sharp, angular wings and a disproportionately large head. But it was the eyes that truly unnerved me. Two tiny, polished stones, dull and obsidian, set deep into the wood, stared out with an unnerving, blank intensity. I picked it up. It felt wrong, utterly wrong, like something that should never have seen the light of day. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the administrative segregation wing, the metallic tang in the air, the detective's impassive face across the table, his words echoing the grim finality of Sarah's death. We understand this is difficult, Omar. But this bird, this thing in my hand, was different. It wasn't just the world's indifference. As I held it, a faint tremor ran through the wood, a sensation that seemed to travel directly into my palm and up my arm, settling deep in my chest. It felt like it was absorbing something from me, drawing out the very essence of my sorrow, warming itself on my pain. The air around me suddenly felt impassably heavy, suffocating. The house was not merely old and desolate, it was watching. And this bird, this unsettling artifact, felt like its eye. I needed it to consume me, to mute the endless static of my own thoughts, the replay of the car's screech, the shattering glass. I spent the first few days in a daze, cleaning. Not with any real purpose, just the methodical motion, the scraping of years of grime from the windowsills, sweeping cobwebs from corners that seemed to stretch into infinity. The house groaned around me, a symphony of settling wood and shifting foundations. Every creak was the house breathing, I told myself, a sigh from its ancient bones. The drafts that snaked through the rooms were just that, drafts, not the brush of something unseen. My grandmother's things were everywhere, a museum of a life I'd only known in fragments. Old photographs, faded tapestries, a rocking chair by the fireplace that still held the faint indentation of her weight. I found myself staring at them, not seeing memories, but just things, objects that refused to yield any comfort. It started subtly. I'd set my car keys on the small hall table, beside the tarnished silver picture frame holding Sarah's smiling face. Minutes later, I'd need them, only to find them not on the table, but on the floor beneath it, or sometimes perched precariously on a stack of old newspapers I hadn't yet touched. My mind, a broken record, instantly supplied the explanation. I read tired, Omar, distracted. Grief does that. I'd nod, accepting the lie, picking up the keys, and trying to ignore the prickle of unease that crawled up my spine. Quick, darting movements at the edge of my vision. A blur against the dusty window pane when I glanced up from a book. Always gone when I focused, leaving only the motes dancing in the afternoon light. My eyes were playing tricks on me, I decided. The old glass in the window, the dust, the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. It was easy to rationalize, especially when the alternative was, what? Something I couldn't articulate, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. They were faint, like the rustling of dry leaves outside, or the murmur of voices from a great distance. Not words, not quite, but an inflection, a cadence that suggested speech. The wind, I'd conclude, sifting through a loose pane, or the creak of the old plumbing. Anything but what my gut screamed at me. But the sense of being watched, that was harder to dismiss. I'd spin around, heart thrumming, expecting to see. What? Nothing, always nothing. I started leaving lights on, even when I left a room for a moment. I was in the library, trying to sort through my grandmother's sprawling collection of books when I heard it distinctly. It was deep, raw, filled with an agony that resonated with my own. My breath hitched. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the house settling. This was something else. I stood frozen, the old book in my hand feeling suddenly heavy, useless. The sound, if it had been a sound at all, vanished. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. A stray animal, a trick of the acoustics. But the moan had been too human, too steeped in suffering. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my palms into my sockets, trying to clear the fog. When I opened them, the library was gone. I was standing in a narrow corridor, the air thick with the smell of ozone and something metallic, like old blood and disinfectant. The walls were stark concrete, stained with what looked like ancient rust. My clothes felt different, coarser, like thin, rough cotton. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear yet, but from sheer, disorienting confusion. Where was I? This wasn't the house. This wasn't anywhere I knew. On either side of the corridor, heavy steel doors were set into the concrete, each with a small, barred slot at eye level. From behind one of these doors, a faint scratching sound began, insistent, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across stone. This was a prison or something worse. My mind screamed at me, desperate to make sense of the sudden, brutal shift in reality. A memory, perhaps, a dream, but the rough fabric against my skin, the acrid smell, the cold floor, it was all too real. I turned, looking for an exit, for any sign of familiarity. The corridor stretched on, a tunnel of despair. And then I saw it, etched roughly into the concrete wall directly opposite me, the words, "Administrative Segregation Wing." The air in my lungs seized. The name, stark and brutal, hit me like a physical blow. It was a place of absolute isolation, a place designed to break spirits, and I was in it. The scratching behind the door intensified, becoming a frantic, clawing sound, accompanied by a low, mournful keening that seemed to vibrate through the concrete itself. It wasn't human. It was something starved, something trapped and desperate. A wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the cold floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate plea for it to end, for the library to return, for the house, no matter how unsettling, to simply be there again. When I opened my eyes, I was back. The old book lay open on the dusty table before me. The scent of aged paper and dry wood filled the air. My clothes were my own, familiar and soft. The library, dimly lit by the single lamp I'd switched on, was exactly as I'd left it. My heart still thudded erratically, a frantic drum against my ribs, and the metallic tang of ozone, the smell of damp earth, lingered faintly in my nostrils, a phantom scent that refused to dissipate. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, sending it clattering to the floor. My hands flew to my face, touching my cheeks, my forehead. I was here. I was in the house. It had been a hallucination, a vivid, horrifying delusion. Grief, exhaustion, the isolation, they were twisting my mind, tearing at the edges of my sanity. That was the only explanation. It had to be. But as I stood there, trembling, the quiet house around me felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something had seen me, truly seen me, in that brief, terrifying glimpse into another reality. And it hadn't just watched. It had touched. I needed it to consume me, to become another layer of the nothingness I felt inside. But the silence here was not empty. It was watchful. I'd started to notice it, in the periphery of my awareness, a subtle shift in the air, a drop in temperature that wasn't explained by drafts or faulty windows. It began as a faint chill, a whisper of winter even in the late spring, settling into the marrow of my bones. I'd shrug, pull my sweater tighter, tell myself the old house was simply that, old and prone to peculiar atmospheric pockets. Then came the scent, not the expected must of damp wood or forgotten textiles, but something else entirely. Lily of the valley, Sarah's favorite. It would bloom in a sudden, overwhelming wave, thick and sweet, in rooms where no flowers existed. I'd spin around, my breath catching, half expecting to see her standing there, a vase of the tiny white bells in her hands, her smile as bright as the morning sun. The objects began to play their cruel tricks. I'd leave my reading glasses on the bedside table, only to find them moments later on the kitchen counter, next to a half-empty mug of tea I hadn't brewed. A particular photograph, a candid shot of Sarah laughing, her hair windswept, would migrate from the mantelpiece to my pillow. Small things, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, a side effect of grief-induced fog. But then the occurrences grew more audacious. One evening, I found her favorite porcelain teacup, the one with the chipped rim she refused to throw away, sitting on the edge of the bath, still damp, as if recently used. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the delicate china cool against my skin. Sarah had loved baths, long, steaming soaks with scented oils. The thought of her here in this house, in this very tub, was a spike of pain so sharp it made me gasp. I hadn't brought that cup with me, I was certain of it. I'd packed only a few essentials, her teacup was not among them. I'd left it in the apartment, packed away with the rest of her things, too painful to look at. I started to check locks twice, to ensure windows were latched. I'd blame an intruder, a phantom presence. But the house remained undisturbed, the dust undisturbed, save for my own footprints. It wasn't just a draft anymore. It was a pervasive, clinging presence, a frigid breath that followed me from room to room. It was strongest in the evenings, when the house settled into its deep, creaking slumber, and I found myself shivering even under thick blankets. It felt personal, targeted, like a predator's icy gaze. The vision started subtly, flickers in my peripheral vision. My head would snap up, my heart racing, but there would be nothing. Then, one afternoon, I was staring out the grimy kitchen window, lost in the monotonous grey of the sky, when I saw her. He was standing in the overgrown garden, near the dilapidated rose bush, wearing the pale blue sundress she'd worn on our honeymoon. Her back was to me, her shoulders gently shaking. She looked so real, so solid, that for a wild, desperate second I forgot everything. My throat closed up. She turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, but her eyes, those beautiful, familiar eyes, were wide with an unspeakable sorrow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, a silent scream seemed to emanate from her, a wave of pure, crushing despair that washed over me, knocking the air from my lungs. The vision wavered, then shimmered, like heat haze on a summer road, and was gone. The garden was empty, save for the swaying weeds and the skeletal rose bush. I stumbled back, my legs weak, collapsing onto a rickety kitchen chair. My breath came in ragged gasps. It wasn't a memory, not just grief. This was something else. Something external, something that was taking her image, her pain, and twisting it into a weapon against me. The line between my mind and this place, this entity, was dissolving. There was I losing my mind. There was the isolation finally breaking me. The thought terrified me more than the vision itself. I gripped the edge of the wooden table, my grip tight. I was losing myself. That night, the house felt different. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for the teacup, the scent, the vision. But there was none. Suddenly, the walls around me seemed to shift. The familiar floral wallpaper of my grandmother's room warped, stretching and flattening into stark, grey concrete. The air grew heavy with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and stale. My bed, a soft feather mattress, hardened beneath me, transforming into a narrow cot with a thin, scratchy blanket. I sat bolt upright, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was no longer in my grandmother's bedroom. I was in a cell, a small, confined space, utterly devoid of comfort or warmth. The door, once a peeling wooden panel, was now a heavy, unyielding steel slab with a small, bolted viewport. A dim, sickly yellow light filtered in from a grate above the door. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of unseen machinery and the distant, echoing clang of metal. I was in an administrative segregation wing. It felt like a prison, a place designed to break spirits, to strip away identity. This wasn't a memory. It was happening now. The entity wasn't just showing me visions. It was warping my reality. It was trapping me, not just in my grief, but in a physical space that mirrored the confines of my tormented mind. This was real. Or my mind had finally snapped, and this was my new, horrifying reality. The silence in the house had become a living thing, no longer just the absence of sound, but a palpable weight pressing against my eardrums. I'd grown accustomed to its watchful quality, the way it seemed to hold its breath whenever I moved, exhaling only in the creaks of old timber or the whisper of wind through a loose pane. But now it was different. A ceramic mug, one of Sarah's favorites, sat on the counter's edge. I had just turned to rinse my plate when a sharp crack echoed through the room. The mug lay shattered on the flagstone floor, shards scattered like fallen teeth. My breath hitched. There was no draft, no tremor, no logical explanation. I stared at the broken pieces, then at the empty space on the counter. My mind scrambled for a reason, a rationalization. Perhaps I had nudged it earlier, left it precariously balanced. Yes, that had to be it. But a prickle of unease, sharp as a splinter, burrowed under my skin. The incidents escalated. A heavy, leather-bound book, One of my grandmother's old botanical guides slid off a shelf in the study and landed with a deafening thud at my feet. I was alone, soaring through a pile of her correspondence, my back to the shelves. I spun around, my heart racing, convinced I would see something. But there was nothing, only the disturbed dust motes dancing in a shaft of light. Each time I tried to rationalize it away, old house, settling foundations, faulty latches. The house began to reveal its hidden depths. One evening, drawn by an inexplicable pull, I found myself in a rarely visited section of the ground floor. It was a corridor I'd always assumed led to nothing more than a storage closet, but a heavy, unadorned door, unlike any other in the house, stood at its end. The air here was stagnant, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid. This wasn't just a forgotten room. It felt like a sealed vault. I twisted the knob. It turned with a grinding protest, and the door swung inward on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow, windowless space. It was stark, almost cell-like, with rough stone walls and a floor of uneven flagstones. This was it, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut. This was the administrative segregation wing. My grandmother, a woman of sharp intellect but quiet eccentricities, had often mentioned a place for contemplation in her letters, but I'd always dismissed it as a euphemism for a quiet reading nook. This was no nook. It was a place designed for isolation, for containment. The air in here was so heavy, so devoid of life, it felt like a vacuum trying to suck the breath from my lungs. I stepped inside, a foolish, morbid curiosity overriding my fear. As I ran my hand along the rough stone wall, my fingers brushed against something. I pulled back, startled, and shone my phone's flashlight. There, etched into the ancient stone, were 3 distinct parallel gouges, as if something with sharp, unyielding claws had dragged itself down the surface. They weren't old weathering marks. The edges were too clean, too fresh. Then the sound came. It was a low, guttural growl, originating from somewhere deep within the stone walls, vibrating through the soles of my feet. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malevolence, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the primal core of my being. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't grief playing tricks. This was external. This was real. The growl intensified, becoming a low, vibrating hum that filled the tiny space, pressing in on me, threatening to crush me. I leaned against it, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't my sorrow. This was something else entirely, something ancient and hungry, thriving in the damp corners of this forgotten house. It had been watching me, feeding on me, and now it was making its presence known. The grief that had been my constant companion suddenly felt like a thin veil, ripped away to reveal a far more terrifying truth beneath. I had to understand. I had to know what this thing was, what it wanted. My grandmother, for all her quiet ways, had been meticulously organized. There had to be something, some clue hidden within her possessions. I thought of her dusty study, the locked chest I'd seen in the attic, the piles of forgotten ledgers and journals. I would find answers. I had to, before whatever was here consumed me entirely. I'd grown accustomed to its watchful quality, the way it seemed to hold its breath whenever I moved, exhaling only in the creaks of old timber or the whisper of unseen currents. But now it felt different. It felt like an answer was waiting, just beyond the reach of my perception, held captive by the very air I breathed. I needed to know. My grandmother's house was a labyrinth of forgotten things, a testament to a life lived and then abruptly abandoned. Dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating the neglect. My grief, once a smothering blanket, had hardened into a desperate resolve. Sarah deserved answers, and so did I. This house held them, I was certain. They were signs, breadcrumbs leading to something far older, far more insidious. I started my search methodically, room by room, no longer flinching at the sudden groan of floorboards or the rustle of drapery. The attic, a mausoleum of trunks and yellowed linens, yielded nothing but faded memories. The main floor, with its heavy furniture draped in white sheets, felt too open, too exposed. My instincts pulled me lower, towards the earth, towards what was hidden. The air hung thick and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and rust. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing across cobweb-laden shelves stacked with forgotten jars and tools. I pushed aside a sagging canvas tarp, revealing a section of the wall that didn't quite match the rough-hewn stone of the rest. It was smoother, almost too uniform, and an old, heavy wooden door, reinforced with thick iron bands, was set into it. No handle, no obvious lock. Just a series of interlocking bolts that seemed to melt into the wood itself, almost invisible until I traced them with my fingers. This wasn't a pantry. This wasn't a wine cellar. This felt like a deliberate containment. A tremor ran through me, a premonition of discovery. I found the hidden mechanism, a rusted lever disguised as part of a support beam. With a grunt, I pulled. A low, grinding shriek echoed through the basement as the bolts retracted. The door, heavy as a tombstone, swung inward with a drawn-out groan, revealing a space beyond. It was a small, windowless room, stark and unsettling. A single, narrow cart, bolted to the floor, occupied one corner. No amenities, no comforts. It was designed for isolation, for absolute sensory deprivation. This was it. On a small, built-in shelf beside the cart lay a stack of leather-bound journals, their pages brittle with age. I reached for the top one, my fingers trembling. I settled onto the edge of the cart, the thin mattress offering no give, and opened the first journal. The script was an elegant, spidery hand, dating back almost a century. The first entries were mundane, observations about the weather, local gossip. Then the tone shifted. The writer, a woman, spoke of an unseen presence, a parasitic entity that thrived on sorrow. She described it as an ancient hunger, drawn to the deepest wells of human despair, a being that didn't kill outright, but consumed the very essence of life, leaving behind only an empty husk. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning for clues, for confirmation. The entries became increasingly frantic, the script more erratic. She detailed how the house itself seemed to breathe with the entity's presence, how the very air became heavy with grief, how sounds twisted into marking echoes of her past. She described seeing her lost child, just as I had seen Sarah, her voice a siren song luring her deeper into madness. "It is not a ghost," one entry screamed, the ink bleeding slightly. "It is a leech, an ancient sorrow eater. It preys on the broken, the grieving, and once it finds its host, it does not let go. It traps I." The word struck me like a physical blow. Traps. This wasn't just my imagination, a psychological breakdown induced by trauma. This was real. This thing, this ancient, parasitic being had found me. It had found my profound sorrow, my bottomless despair over Sarah, and it had burrowed deep. It didn't need physical bars. It built prisons of the mind, fortresses of fear and grief. A faint scratching sound started then, from the other side of the heavy door. Not rhythmic, not persistent, but like something large and clawed was dragging itself slowly across the rough concrete of the basement floor. The metallic, sweet scent in the air intensified, clinging to the back of my throat, making me gag. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the journal. The woman's final entry was barely legible, a scrawled, desperate plea. "There is no escape, only consumption. It has me. It has us all." The scratching outside the door grew louder, closer. A low, guttural growl rumbled, vibrating through the thick door, through the cart, straight into my bones. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something else, something far older, far more malevolent. My worst fears, the ones I had tried to rationalize away, were not only confirmed, but amplified into a horrifying, inescapable reality. I was trapped, and the entity was no longer content to merely observe. It was coming for me. The growl tore through me, not just a sound in the air, but a vibration that resonated in my very marrow. It was an ancient, predatory hunger pressing against the heavy oak door. The scratching intensified, a frantic, desperate rasping that echoed the frantic, desperate rhythm of my own heart. I pressed myself against the cart's grimy mattress, wishing I could melt into the threadbare fabric, become invisible. Then the door shuddered. Not just a tremor, but a deep, structural groan, as if something immense was throwing its weight against it. A sliver of light, thin as a razor, appeared along the bottom edge, then vanished as the door buckled inwards. Splinters flew, tiny projectiles that stung my cheek. A raw, damp cold seeped into the room, carrying with it the smell of stagnant water and something metallic, like old blood. "Omar," a whisper, soft as the rustle of silk, drifted through the cracking wood. It was Sarah's voice, clear as a bell, full of the lightness I remembered from our first date. Why did I leave me? My breath hitched. My entire body larked up. It couldn't be. I knew it couldn't be her, but the sound, the inflection, the very soul of her voice twisted my gut. "I know why," I choked out, a pathetic, wavering sound. The door groaned again, more violently this time, and a deeper crack spiderwebbed across the wood. Through the new fissure, a sliver of darkness, thicker than any night, seemed to ooze. It brought with it a sensation of profound sorrow, a crushing weight of every regret I'd ever harbored, every unspoken word, every missed opportunity. "I could have saved me," her voice accused, now tinged with a brittle, icy edge. "I let me go." The words were a physical blow. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into my sockets until stars danced behind my eyelids. Lies, all lies. But the entity knew where to strike. It knew the raw, festering wounds of my guilt. When I opened my eyes, the room was different. The familiar, peeling wallpaper of my grandmother's house had vanished. The single window, previously boarded, was replaced by a narrow, reinforced slit high above, letting in a sickly, artificial light. The heavy oak door was gone, replaced by a thick steel slab, painted an institutional grey, with a small, bolted hatch in its center. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and a faint, acrid smell I couldn't place. I was no longer in the bedroom. My mind reeled. Had I passed out? Was this a dream? The concrete floor was rough beneath my bare feet as I scrambled back, pressing myself into the corner. This wasn't a room in the house. It was a cage. It pulsed with a sickening, internal light, a deep, bruised purple that seemed to suck the color from the air around it. I could feel it trying to pry open the closed chambers of my mind, searching for the deepest, most agonizing memories. I gasped, fighting against the intrusive touch. My hands flew to my head, trying to press the invading thoughts away. Sarah's last moments flashed before my eyes. The sickening screech of tires, the shattered glass, the horrific stillness. The entity was projecting them, amplifying them, forcing me to relive every excruciating detail. A guttural cry tore from my throat. I couldn't let it win. Not like this. Sarah deserved better than for me to be consumed by this parasitic thing. My grandmother. He had lived here in this house for decades. He had seen things, experienced things. There had to be a way. But then my eyes snagged on something. Not on the wall, but on the floor, tucked into a hairline crack where the wall met the concrete slab. A tiny, almost imperceptible fold of aged paper. My fingers, trembling, scrabbled at the crack, digging into the grime. I pulled it free. It was a single, yellowed page, torn from what looked like an old journal. The script was my grandmother's familiar, elegant hand, though shakier than I remembered. My eyes darted across the faded ink, struggling to make sense of the archaic language and cryptic symbols. To starve it, one must sever the root, not prune the branch. The ties that bind, though forged in love, become its chains. A ritual of severance, absolute and unforgiving. The memory, a sacrifice. The heart, emptied. To defeat this thing, I had to let go of Sarah. Not just the grief, but the memory of her. Erase her from my mind, sever the bond that allowed the entity to latch on. The words were a bitter poison burning in my throat. It knew. It sensed my discovery, my internal conflict. A low, triumphant chuckle echoed through the administrative segregation wing, a sound that promised endless torment. The cost. To save myself, to save what little was left of me, I had to sacrifice the most precious thing I had. Sarah's face, her laugh, the warmth of her hand in mine. Everything. It was an unbearable choice, a cruelty I hadn't thought possible. But what was the alternative? To be consumed, to become an empty vessel for this monstrous grief. The thought of that was worse than any oblivion. I clutched the brittle page, my grip tight, the words searing into my mind. I had found my weapon, but its edge was turned against my own heart. The words echoed in the hollow space of my mind, a chilling pronouncement that had settled into my bones. The memory, a sacrifice. To defeat this insidious thing, I had to sever the bond. Not just the grief, which was a natural human ache, but the memory of Sarah. Erase her from my mind, rip her image, her laugh, her touch from the very fabric of my being. It was an act of unthinkable cruelty, a betrayal more profound than anything I could imagine, yet it was the only path left. My determination, born from a desperate terror of losing myself entirely, solidified. I found myself drawn to the deepest part of the house, a place I'd avoided since my grandmother's passing, the root cellar. It was a forgotten space, perpetually damp, smelling of earth and decay, a perfect metaphor for the rot that had taken root within me. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic tang that wasn't rust, but something sharper, like old fear. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each creak sounding like a distant, distorted lark clicking into place, sealing me into an inevitable fate. At the bottom, where damp earth usually met rough-hewn stone, the space had transformed. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed wire directly above my head, casting a harsh, isolating light on a narrow corridor that hadn't been there moments before. The ceiling was low, pressing down, and the air was dead, devoid of movement, thick with an unnatural stillness. This wasn't the cellar anymore. This was the administrative segregation wing, a place where minds were broken, where memories were meant to be stripped away, leaving only compliant emptiness. It was the entity's twisted sanctuary, built from my own deepest fears of loss and confinement, a labyrinthine trap designed to keep me perpetually isolated with my pain. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a sound that resonated deep in my chest, a parasitic frequency. I knew it was here waiting. This was where the final confrontation would happen, not with fists or weapons, but with the fragile architecture of my mind. There were no doors, no cells, just an unending stretch of grey, punctuated by the stark glare of more bare bulbs. But as I moved, images began to flicker on the walls, projected from within me, fueled by the entity. Sarah's face, smiling, Sarah's hand reaching for mine. Sarah, laughing in the kitchen, her hair catching the morning light. They were perfect, pristine, agonizingly real. It was Sarah's voice, sweet and tender, laced with a plea. I wouldn't forget me, would I, Omar? My breath hitched. My throat tightened. This was the sacrifice. I had to let go. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them until kaleidoscopic patterns exploded behind my eyelids. The entity wanted me to look, to cling. I wouldn't. I remember the first time we met. The voice continued, now sharper, more insistent, still wearing Sarah's intonations. At the bookstore, I dropped my coffee all over my new copy of Wuthering Heights. A faint smile touched my lips, unbidden. The memory was so vivid, the embarrassment, the clumsy apology, the way her eyes had crinkled at the corners when she laughed. It was a beautiful memory. It was also a weapon. I opened my eyes, forcing myself to look at the concrete wall ahead. The images intensified, swirling, overlapping. Sarah holding our wedding bouquet. Sarah asleep beside me, her head nestled against my shoulder. Sarah consoling me after my grandmother's funeral. Each one a jewel, each one a shard. No, I choked out, the word raw. It felt like tearing strips of flesh from my own bones. No, I can't, I won't. The entity shrieked, a sound like grinding teeth on bone, a sound that ripped through the air of the administrative segregation wing, making the single bulb above me flicker wildly. The images on the walls writhed, distorted, becoming monstrous versions of Sarah, her face stretched, her eyes empty. This was it, the true battle. I had to confront each memory, embrace its beauty, its pain, and then, with every fiber of my being, consciously release it. It was like watching a loved one walk away, knowing they would never return, and being the one to open the door for them. I focused on the bookstore, the warmth of her laugh, the way the coffee stained her shirt, the spark in her eyes. I held it, cherished it, let it wash over me. And then, with a guttural cry that scraped my throat raw, I pushed it away. Not erased, not forgotten, but released. I imagined it as a fragile butterfly, taking flight, soaring away from me out of reach. The entity screamed again, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and the image on the wall dissolved into a swirling vortex of grey static. It felt weakened. I moved forward, my legs heavy, my chest aching. The next image materialized, our wedding day, the scent of lilies, the nervous tremor in her hand as I placed the ring on her finger, the profound, overwhelming joy. This was harder. You are nothing without her. No, I gasped, tears streaming down my face, blurring the image. I am me, and I loved her, and I will always love her. but I will not let you have her. I held the memory, this sacred, beautiful memory, in my mind's eye. I felt the warmth, the love, the promise. And then, with a deliberate, agonizing effort, I let it go. I pictured the light of that day receding, fading gently into the distance, a star winking out, not gone, but beyond my grasp, beyond the entity's reach. The administrative segregation wing shuddered. The concrete walls cracked, hairline fractures spiderwebbing across the surface. Dust rained down. The entity's presence, though still immense, was fraying at the edges, like a tapestry unraveling. The revelation hit me then, a blinding flash amidst the torment. The entity didn't just feed on grief. It fed on the attachment to specific, tangible memories, those that anchored us to our sorrow. By releasing them, not by forgetting, but by severing the possessive grip, I wasn't erasing Sarah. I was setting her free from the entity's twisted appropriation, and in doing so, freeing myself. This wasn't about forgetting. It was about surrendering control, about accepting that love could exist without clinging, that memory could be honored without being a cage. The entity thrived on the clinging, on the refusal to let go. The corridor stretched on, each section now a gallery of Sarah's life, her face, her moments, her essence. Each one a battle, each one a release. My heart was breaking, shattering into a million pieces with every act, yet a strange, terrifying strength was building within me. I was emptying myself, not of love, but of the very anchors that bound the entity to my soul. And as each memory floated away, the administrative segregation wing around me seemed to buckle and groan, a prison beginning to collapse. Zai. NG effort. I pushed the image of her face, her laugh, her touch, away from the twisting, grasping tendrils that sought to corrupt it. I would not let it be tainted. I would not let her be tainted. The air in the room, already heavy with the scent of decay and something metallic, thickened instantly, pressing in on me like a physical weight. The shadows, which had always seemed to cling to the corners of this house, now writhed and stretched, elongating into impassable shapes that clawed at the periphery of my vision. A low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, reverberated through the floorboards, up my legs, and into my very bones. It was the sound of furious disappointment, of an insatiable hunger denied. The room around me began to buckle. The wallpaper, peeling and stained, seemed to ripple like stagnant water. The floorboards groaned and shifted, not beneath my weight, but as if the very structure of the house was convulsing. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching out to steady myself against a wall that felt suddenly slick and cold, like polished steel. The familiar musty smell of old wood and forgotten dust vanished, replaced by an acrid, sterile tang that burned my nostrils. My eyes, still blurred with tears, struggled to focus. The dim light filtering through the grime-streaked windows was gone. The walls had transformed. No longer plaster and lath. They were now seamless, grey panels, bolted together with heavy, visible rivets. The door, once a warped wooden slab, was a thick, reinforced portal, devoid of handles, emblazoned with a single, stark number, 7. A suffocating sense of isolation descended upon me, more profound than any I had felt in this desolate house. I was no longer in my grandmother's living room. I was in an administrative segregation wing. This was a place designed to break spirits, to strip away identity, to enforce utter, inescapable solitude. The entity hadn't just changed the room, it had fabricated a prison specifically for my mind. The air was still, utterly devoid of natural sound. No creak of settling wood, no distant rustle of leaves against glass. Only the faint, almost imperceptible hum of unseen machinery, a low thrum that vibrated deep within my chest. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if every inch of my skin was under scrutiny. This is where I belong, where I will truly be alone. This place, this fabricated cage, felt more real than anything I had experienced in the house. The memory of Sarah, which I had clung to so fiercely, now felt fragile, threatened by the overwhelming emptiness of this wing. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure her face again, her warmth, the vibrant color of her eyes. But the sterility of the administrative segregation wing was too powerful. It bleached out all color, all warmth, leaving only a monochrome landscape of despair. But then a flicker, not an image, but a sensation. The phantom warmth of her hand in mine, the ghost of her laughter brushing against my ear. It was faint, almost imperceptible against the crushing weight of the administrative segregation wing, but it was there. I don't get to define my grief. I pushed away from the wall, my legs trembling. I wouldn't succumb to it. I wouldn't let it become my reality. I wouldn't let it become Sarah's tomb. I took a shaky step forward, then another. The air resisted, thick and heavy, as if I were moving through water, but I moved. I walked slowly, deliberately through the sterile corridor that had materialized around me. Each step was an act of defiance, a refusal to be confined, a refusal to be broken. The low hum intensified, rising in pitch, a desperate, thwarted shriek. The air grew impassably thin, stealing my breath. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a searing pain in my temples. It was trying to crush me, to collapse the space around me, to make me disappear into its manufactured oblivion. I gasped, falling to my knees, my hands instinctively going to my head. The green light pulsed, searing my vision. And then, with a deafening crack that seemed to split the very fabric of the air, it shattered. The grey panels warped, twisted, and then peeled away like old paint, revealing the familiar, stained wallpaper beneath. The sterile tang evaporated, replaced by the comforting, if musty, scent of old house. I was back in the living room, sprawled on the threadbare rug. I lay there for a long time, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. My head throbbed, and a dull ache resonated deep within my chest. When I finally pushed myself up, my muscles screamed in protest. My hands, when I looked at them, were scraped and bleeding, as if I had clawed my way out of something solid. My shirt was torn at the shoulder, a thin line of blood welling on my skin. The house was quiet, too quiet, banished, perhaps. I felt profoundly, irrevocably changed. The administrative segregation wing had been a mental construct, a psychological weapon, but the wounds it inflicted were real. A piece of me, I knew, had been left behind in that spectral prison, a part of my spirit scarred by the absolute desolation it had offered. The house, too, felt different. Cleansed, perhaps, but also tainted, a memory of absolute evil etched into its very foundations. I had survived, but I was no longer just Omar, the widower. I was Omar, the survivor of a battle that had left me with a permanent, invisible wound. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the silence was only temporary. The entity might be gone, but its mark remained, both on me and on this haunted place. I remember the cold, sterile air of the administrative segregation wing, the way the fluorescent lights hummed a constant, low thrum that burrowed into my skull. It had been my world, my prison for, I don't know how long. Time had become a fluid, meaningless concept, stretching and shrinking like a dying breath. But then, a voice, deep and resonant, had cut through the fog. Omar, it had said, art the resident, or the subject, just Omar. A name, a sliver of identity in the vast, echoing emptiness. My release was not a celebration. It was a transfer, a careful disentanglement. They didn't understand what I had seen, what I had done. They spoke of stress-induced psychosis, of grief manifesting as delusion. I let them talk. Their words were a shield, a convenient fiction that allowed me to step back into the world, albeit a world forever warped. The house, they said, had been condemned, sealed off. No one was going back. Good. Stepping out of the facility, the sun felt like a physical blow. It was too bright, too loud, the world too vibrant after the muted, grey existence I'd endured. A colleague, a man named Robert from my old firm, was waiting. He looked older, his face etched with concern. He didn't ask questions, just opened the passenger door of his sedan. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. I tried to rebuild. The walls were thin, letting in the muffled sounds of my neighbors' lives, laughter, arguments, the clatter of dishes. Normalcy, I told myself, was a balm, but the balm was thin, easily pierced. The first time it happened, I was at a coffee shop. The aroma of roasted beans, the clinking of mugs, the low murmur of conversations, it was all so ordinary. I was trying to read a newspaper, focusing on the mundane headlines, when the woman at the next table shifted in her seat. My breath caught in my throat. My grip tightened on the newspaper, crinkling the page. It wasn't a hallucination. I knew it wasn't. It was a flicker, a momentary tear in the fabric of what people called reality. The entity hadn't been defeated. It hadn't been banished. It had simply receded, like a tide pulling back, leaving behind a residue of its presence. The world was no longer solid. It was permeable. I saw it everywhere now, or thought I did. It was still there, an ache in my chest, but it was now intertwined with a profound, unsettling knowledge. The entity had fed on my sorrow, yes, but it had also imprinted upon me. It had shown me a glimpse of what lay beneath the surface, the vast, indifferent malevolence that waited for cracks to form. It wasn't personal anymore, not truly. I tried to explain it once, to a therapist recommended by Robert. I chose my words carefully, framing it as a series of vivid nightmares, a prolonged hallucination. The therapist, a kind, older woman, nodded empathetically, prescribing medication, suggesting coping mechanisms. I took the pills, I tried the exercises. They dulled the edges, softened the sharp corners of my perception, but they couldn't erase the knowing. I learned to live with it. I went back to work, slowly, cautiously. My colleagues were understanding, treating me with a gentle deference. I went through the motions, signed documents, attended meetings, but every interaction was filtered through this new lens. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside was quiet and the hum of my refrigerator was the loudest sound, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. I would remember Sarah's laugh, the warmth of her hand in mine, and the grief would well up, fresh and sharp. The knowledge that my sorrow had been an invitation, a feast, and that the entity, whatever it truly was still out there. It was always out there. I was free of the house, yes, but I was not free. I carried the house and its occupant within me. My life was no longer my own. It was a testament to what had happened, a quiet, perpetual haunting. It had simply changed its address, and I was its new, permanent dwelling.